All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is where we're picking up. We introduced this last week, talked about the ideas that are presented here in this chapter. As we talked about, Paul says at the very beginning of opening up this section, he said, I've delivered to you, this is of first importance. What does that phrase, first importance, mean? Yeah, this is number one priority. This is number one thing. And that is, of course, that Jesus died according to the scriptures. He was buried. He was resurrected the third day according to the scriptures. So everything else that Paul has taught them is really built on this foundation. Now, much of what he's talked to them about is the way that they live their lives, the way that they specifically worship together. But it still is built upon this foundation of the resurrection, the burial, or the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. Now, I'm not going to review everything that we talked about last week. I do have the same slides up. There's one thing in particular I want to emphasize about this first slide. I actually put it in red, and I tried to make these bigger. So hopefully it's helping. I am listening. Somebody told me that it was just a little hard to read. So I'm going to try to put fewer words, larger font, and make it a little bit easier to read. Paul made this statement here about how this gospel message is what he delivered to them, what they received, in which they stand, by which they're saved. But then he said, unless you believe in vain. As we talked about, that's a unique word that Paul does not normally use in his writings. Normally, the word that is translated vain, and we'll see it in what we talk about tonight, means empty. That's the way it's often used in the book of Ecclesiastes, even though that's Hebrew and this is Greek. Still have that same basic idea of emptiness. But the word that is used here means to no purpose. It's just something that's doing, but you're not doing it for any purpose. And I want to emphasize that because if we make it all the way to verse 19, I think that's why Paul used this word here, because he's introducing the thought that he's going to kind of wrap up with in this first section. So then we talked a little bit about the wordplay. And again, this is important to realize how much Paul uses some higher forms of literature in his writings. Sometimes we don't see that in English. Just because we have different languages built on different literary principles, that some of the wordplay doesn't really translate well into English. But those who are Greek scholars can point those things out. And that's the great thing about having the ability to read from those who are Greek scholars, is they can point stuff out like this. And Paul does this a lot to connect ideas together, to make it clearer, to tie things together. And again, I'm going to point out what I said here, that this word vain means to no purpose. Then we talked about what was it that he made known to them. And as we've discussed, that's really what we got to, and this is where we're going to pick up tonight, is he starts talking about the eyewitnesses. And the reason why I want to make this point is when you talk about people like Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, what do you think of men like that? What were they renowned for? Yeah, they were renowned for their logic. They were renowned for their thinking. The Greeks were very proud of their thinking. Now, did the Greeks invent logic? No, obviously God did. The book of Isaiah has got some great examples of that. In Isaiah chapter 1, we're not going to go back and look at all these, but in verse 18, I think it is. Yeah, verse 18 of Isaiah chapter 1. God says to the people of Israel through Isaiah, come, let us reason together. What is reason? It's logic. God is essentially saying, let's talk about this logically. And he goes on to talk about how he had given them a covenant that they were ignoring and what the consequences would be for them. In chapter 44, there's even a greater example of God using logic. He talks about a man going into the forest, cutting down a tree, and he takes half of the tree and he cooks his food and warms his house. What does he do with the other half of the tree? Yeah, he makes his God. And Isaiah just points out how illogical that is. Which half of the tree did you choose to make your God out of? And the other half, you cooked your food and made your house warm. Completely illogical. God used that kind of logic centuries before the Greeks had ever even thought of something like that. But they were renowned for their logic. Well, Paul is going to use some of the higher forms of this logic in this chapter. We've actually already looked at some of them. When he says, according to the scriptures, what is Paul pointing out? This is consistent with things that have already been written and accepted. That's precedent. Judicial and legal precedent. That's what Paul is saying here. This is something that's already been established. It's already been accepted. And what I'm telling you about Jesus is just consistent with that precedent. So that's one form of logic. The next thing is what we're going to start here. If there's a trial, what is the most effective way to convict someone or to keep them from being convicted? It's somebody who has firsthand knowledge of exactly what happened, an eyewitness. And so what does Paul do here? Well, he starts in verse 5. He appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. And after that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren, most of whom remain till now. Some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me. So what does Paul do? That resurrection of Jesus, there's a lot of people who can tell you they saw him with their own eyes after he died, after he was buried, and they saw him raised back to life. Again, these are logical arguments that Paul is making to confirm this message, to confirm to them that in fact, Jesus has been resurrected from the dead. Let's talk just a little bit about Paul's statement about himself. As to one untimely born, does anybody have a different translation? In fact, I'm certain that somebody has a different translation. How does your translation read? Adam, I think you use the New International. No.
Christian Standard.
Okay.
Abnormally born.
All right, abnormally born. Does anybody else have something different? Well, they had bound to be some. We all must be using the same translations. It's an interesting term. This is used to describe a miscarriage. And Paul is essentially describing himself as being a miscarriage. Now, he's obviously not talking about his physical birth. He's talking about his spiritual birth in Christ. But he's talking about himself as coming at the wrong time. Now, when I say wrong, he's not blaming God. But he's saying that he was born at a different time than all the other eyewitnesses. And that brings me to an interesting question. I've got up here, is Paul arrogant or is Paul humble? The reason why I ask the question, obviously, the answer is obvious. But the reason why I put this up is because I had someone in a congregation where I used to work many years ago who came to me in all sincerity and said, I think Paul is just arrogant. I mean, he's just arrogant. What's that? He's confident. But what is he confident in? That's the question. And that's where I think this person was missing Paul. I want you to notice something. Kevin talked about this last Wednesday, I think, when you spoke on the short talk. Let's drop down to verse 10, excuse me. Look at what he says here. And I love what Kevin had to say about this. I am what I am. His grace extraordinary, not prevail. I labored even more than all of them. Did you grasp what Paul just said? Who's the them that he's talking about? The apostles, the 12 or the other apostles. And Paul says, I labored more than they did, all of them. If you take that at face value and stop right at that point, what's our answer? Paul's arrogant. He's saying, I did more than all of them. But of course, he didn't stop there. What's the next thing he says? He says, not I, but the grace of God with me. And so what does Paul think about everything that he did in his life from the time he committed himself to Jesus? Well, it was never enough, but how is it being done? What's being accomplished?
Just the best.
Exactly. He's just the vessel. I'll give you a spoiler alert. When we get into 2 Corinthians, he really is going to emphasize that point, the idea of the vessel. But Paul, in all of these things where he talks about boasting, here he says, I labored even more than all of them. Every time he is going to condition that by saying, not me, this is what God has done. So, yes, Paul says, I did more than all of them. But what he's saying really is, God did more through me than all of them. And that was his point. All of the glory goes to God. And it always does in all of his writings. But let's go ahead, please.
I think a human level too is all probably so internally distraught with the person that you felt like I'm starting this race so far behind everybody else. I've got more than, it's not necessarily the case. I've got more to do, more to make up possible.
And I would even argue that he understood he never could make it up. But it was a situation, and he says that right here in this context. That's what Kevin did such a good job talking about last week, that he recognized what he had done against God. And now by the grace of God, through God's grace, he was able to serve and glorify God. And that's again going to bring us back to what we talked about, believing to a purpose. It was very true in Paul's life that when he said, you are Lord, that everything he did from that point forward was conditioned upon that statement, you are my Lord. So he uses himself as an example of this idea of what does it mean that the death, burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the foundation of everything. It's the most important thing. So he's using himself as an example of that. And I'm not going to redo everything Kevin talked about, but that's what you see here in verses 9 through 11, is this idea that I am nothing. He's nothing because of what he'd done against God. But he is something in the sense that he is a vessel that God is using. All right, let's move on now to verse 12. Here is another, and I missed that part. Here is another great example of this idea of Greek logic. What we're going to find here, I forgot how and I'm sorry, I forgot to put this one up here, where Paul talks about his own personal example. I'm sure you've heard people talk about the idea of if-then statements. What is an if-then statement? What does it mean?
Conditional statement. If you will do this, then I will do this.
Exactly. Or in this case, it's if this is true, then this must be true. But yeah, either way, it's a conditional statement. And what it does is it leads down a path. Again, this is a logical conclusion If this be true, then the next step that is conditioned upon that, that must be true. So what Paul is going to do now is he's going to start with something that existed among some there in Corinth. Look at verse 12. Now, if Christ is preached, remember that was the first thing. This is the message that I delivered to you that you received, in which you stand, by which you're saved. So the first thing was, here's what I preached. If Christ is preached that he has been raised from the dead, that's what the eyewitness testimony is. If Christ has been preached that he is raised from the dead, how do some among you say there is no resurrection of the dead? Essentially, there were some of them in the congregation in Corinth. We're not talking about the Gentiles. We're not talking about the unbelievers, the atheists. We're not talking about those who believed in the Greek and Roman pantheon of gods. This was among their fellowship, which he described back in chapter 1 as the church of God. There were some of them who denied that there was life after death. So Paul wants to deal with that. And he's asking the question, how is it that you say that? And what he's going to do is he's going to show a series of 7 conclusions that will lead them to. Each one of these conclusions is further and further away from God. And that's what Paul wants them to see. If you don't believe in life after death, where's that path going to lead you? If this, then this, then this, then this. So if there is no resurrection from the dead, the first conclusion is Christ has not been raised. So Jesus died, he was buried. End of story. Even though there are eyewitnesses that said we saw him alive. But if there is no resurrection of the dead, that didn't happen. So that's the first conclusion. Now he builds on that. In verse 14, if Christ has not been raised, then what's the next conclusion? Well, the next conclusion is that message that I preached to you, that you received, in which you stand, by which you are saved, that was vain. Now that's the word empty there. So Paul says, this message that I was preaching to you, nothing but hot air. Wasn't true, wasn't real. Okay, if the preaching was vain, the next conclusion is your faith is vain. Because remember, what was their faith based on? The preaching, specifically preached on the gospel. So now it's gone from, okay, Christ is still in the ground, and everything I said to you was just hot air, and what you believe is empty. It's nothingness. You can see how each conclusion is getting us further and further away from God. If in fact your faith is vain, then what does Paul say that says about me and all of these others that have been preaching this message? Not only is it empty, Paul says, we're liars. He says we're lying when we tell you that we saw Jesus alive. The word that is translated witness is a fascinating word. It is the Greek word martyr. When you think of Stephen as a martyr, we think of someone who died for the cause of Christ. But literally what it means is Stephen witnessed for the cause of Christ. He was so convinced of what he believed in, the message that he was giving, that he was willing to die for it. That's a great lesson for us when we talk about being witnesses of Jesus Christ. It means something we're willing to die for. But Paul says, if in fact there is no resurrection of the dead, then we're dying for a lie, or we're willing to die for a lie. We're in fact telling something, we're giving witness of something that's just simply not true. And he says, if we are false witnesses, You're still in sin. Wasn't that why they came to Christ? Isn't that why I came to Christ? You came to Christ to be forgiven of our sins. If there is no resurrection from the dead, then I'm still in my sins. And he said, all of those who have already died are destroyed. The word that is used, destroyed, here is the same word that's the word of Satan. Satan is the destroyer. And in fact, if there is no life after death, then Satan won. Because we're all destroyed. That's what he wants. And he wins. You'll often hear people talk about, I can't accept that Jesus is the Son of God. I can't accept that I've got to be baptized for forgiveness of my sins because that means my ancestor of some sort would be lost. Well, let me tell you, the opposite of that is true. If you don't believe in life after death, if you don't live for the fact that Jesus died, was buried, and was resurrected, then that means all of those who have died for Christ are destroyed. They're lost. In fact, that's another lie of Satan. When people say, I can't believe that because that means. No, if you don't believe it, that means they're lost. And then finally, he says, we are of all people most to be pitied. These logical arguments are impeccable. Those men I mentioned earlier, they've all been impressed by what Paul has to say here, the logical conclusion that he's led them to. Those people who did not believe in life after death, I'm sure they didn't understand the conclusion of what it was they believed in until Paul shows them. Again, remember, we're talking about people who are part of the church of God. Paul says that about them. But we also have to recognize there are conclusions that our beliefs lead us to. And we need to make sure we understand what those conclusions are, those logical progression of what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? And that's the point that Paul is making here. Does that help us to understand why Paul says this is of first importance? Yeah, I mean, if we are of all men most to be pitied, that sounds very, very important to me. And so Paul wants us to understand that. Of course, now what he's going to do in verse 20 is he's going to say, of course, Christ has been raised from the dead. That's, obviously what he's telling us is the beginning point of this logical train that we follow. That beginning point is wrong. And those of you among you who are saying there is no life after death, you've started from the wrong point. And when you started from the wrong starting point, you cannot get to the right finish point. So that's why he started. He says, I want to tell you, this is the most important thing. You've got to start at the right point. And the right point is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Anybody with any thoughts or questions before we dig into some of this a little bit deeper? Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Paul had a congregation where we've never had this big a discrepancy where some people don't believe in the resurrection.
I fully agree with you on that. It's hard to have fellowship when you cannot agree or do not agree on the very foundation of what is Christianity. Now, when I say Paul described them at the beginning of his letter as the church of God, understand that he's telling them there's things that need to be fixed and they need to be fixed now. And that's obviously what this conclusion to this letter is all about, is this has to be fixed now. But thank you for that point. Absolutely. Does it seem to you to be strange or unusual not to believe in life after death? Were there other groups that did not believe in life after death? Yeah. Let's go back to the sects that existed in the time of Jesus. What about the Sadducees? Luke tells us that. And the conflicts that Jesus had with them. Remember that time where the Sadducees thought they had an argument that Jesus couldn't answer? Probably because the Pharisees had never come up with a decent answer to it. About the woman whose husband died, then she married his brother, and then brother and 7 brothers, they all died. There were no children. Which one of them is going to have him in, which one of them will she be the wife to? The Pharisees probably had no answer to that. They probably, just kind of hemmed and hawed and scratched their heads, and they couldn't answer it. The Sadducees thought, we've got this argument. So they brought that to Jesus. And of course, Jesus dealt with that very easily. But the Sadducees were a group that did not believe in life after death. In Acts chapter 17, we find where the Apostle Paul was speaking to a group of people in Athens. Remember, he said, you are very religious in all aspects. So again, we're not talking about atheists in the way we normally think of atheists. And they wanted, you talk about the kind of audience that all of us would like to have. They took him to a public place, Mars Hill, where he could speak to hundreds of people and they could all hear him very clearly without microphones. And he declared to them the message of Jesus Christ. We find that recorded in Acts chapter 17. When did that message end? What was the statement of Paul that they said, we're not listening to you anymore? The resurrection. He said, God furnished proof by resurrecting him from the dead. And the Athenians that Luke tells us loved to hear any new thing. Well, it wasn't quite any new thing, because they decided that's a new thing we're not listening to anymore. And many of them scoffed and walked away. They could not believe anybody could come up with something so ridiculous as to believe in life after death. But we're also told that some did believe and wanted to hear more about that message. So yeah, it to some people, to some hearts, that's just completely unreasonable. But then for other hearts, they will recognize that, in fact, life after death is, in fact, what God has made us for. All right, let's go back to what we talked about at the beginning. Go back to chapter 15 there at verse 2. Paul here said the statement, verse 2. He talked to this 4-part statement. The gospel that I preached to you, that you received, in which you stand, by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to it, unless you believe to no purpose. What's the purpose that he's talking about here? When you talk about how important the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is, what purpose does that have? Does that mean? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for you? If I was to make the statement that I talked about last week, if there's nothing else you take away from tonight's class, this is what I want you to take away from the class. What does it mean to believe that? To purpose, with purpose. Okay. Labor.
That's right. Grace.
Exactly. That's what he's talking about here. He's talking about labor. Is it possible for me to not believe in life after death? even if I academically do believe it? Yeah, exactly. If I live my life for today, for tomorrow, for 10 years until I retire, until I am able to play with my grandchildren, until I get my house paid off, or until whatever it is that I've got all my goals that I've set. If that's what I'm living for, do I believe in life after death? No. Thanks, Kay. That's exactly the point. When Paul is talking about believing to a purpose, or from the negative saying, unless you believe to no purpose, he wasn't just talking about someone who will come up and you say, you know what? I really just don't believe in life after death. But he's talking about people who live in such a way that they don't believe in life after death. They live for life instead of living for eternity. How do you live for life instead of living for eternity? How does that show? And when I say show, it may not show to anybody else but you. I'll tell you, as I thought about this, I realized there's too much of my life that I've spent living for life. Too much of my life where my plans revolve around what I'm going to do next week, or what I'm going to do next month or next year, how I'm going to, save up for retirement. I don't see Paul thinking about those things. I don't see Jesus thinking about those things. Instead, what I see with them is they were thinking about, how can I glorify my God now so that I can take other people to eternity with me? Because he was living for eternity. So this statement I mentioned to you last week, where Paul makes this statement, unless, bump, 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 and the camera focuses in, unless you believe to no purpose. That's a little scary, especially when we put it in the context of what Paul is talking about. Unless we're living our lives thinking about today, or thinking about the rest of my life in this physical body. Anybody with thoughts or comments or disagreement? Yep. Yep, absolutely. Anybody else? Well, as we say in my job, whenever we have a meeting that doesn't run all the way up to the scheduled end of it, I'll give you some time back. We'll pick up at verse 20 next week. Not many. I did have one today.